Welcome back to the Rock Room and another episode of the Rock Your Divorce podcast, where we help men successfully navigate the divorce process in a healthy way. I'm your host, Stephen Valente. If you're like me, you are on an emotional roller coaster that feels like there's no end in sight. You might be choosing isolation or reckless behavior, or both. You are searching for ways to quiet the noise and numb the pain. And you're lying awake at night, sick to your stomach, wondering how this divorce is going to affect the relationship with your children. If that sounds like you, then you are absolutely in the right place. Because in today's episode, we're going to talk about how the way you handle this divorce is ultimately going to define your legacy. That sounds like something you're interested in? Then plug in, turn it up, and let's hit the stage. As we discuss here on the Rock Your Divorce podcast, there are 7 key areas of your life that if you focus on them each and every day, you will be able to successfully navigate this divorce process in a healthy way, and you will absolutely thrive afterward. The visual that I normally give, of course, is that of a 7-channel mixing board, where each of those channels represents one of the 7 key areas of your life. And the faders themselves are the amount of time or effort or energy that you're putting into each of those key areas, either on an hourly, daily, or weekly basis. And as we've discussed in the past, going through the divorce process, it is virtually impossible to be able to balance everything that's going on in your life across all of those key 7. However, if you just focus on a couple key components within each, you will absolutely be able to do that. Today's episode really spans a couple of those key areas, and the title of today is really defining your legacy, right? And we're going to get a little bit more into what is a legacy and why it's important a little bit later on in the episode. But I want to remind you that I heard something one time that said, define yourself before somebody else does. So as we go through this episode, I want you to kind of keep that in the back of your mind, because ultimately how you handle this divorce will define the legacy that you leave in many different ways. So in my own divorce and in the divorces of men that I have coached in the past or am coaching now, there are a lot of mistakes that men make in relation to how does this ultimately help me or hurt me define the legacy that I'm leaving as I go through this divorce. I think it breaks down really into 2 main categories that I'm seeing with the mistakes. And the first one is mental. The mental mistakes, the first thing that comes to mind, of course, is allowing these negative or personal attacks, whether it's from your, soon-to-be former spouse or former spouse, family members, past family members, coworkers, friends that are in your inner circle, or just the general community around you that may know that you are going through this divorce process right now. And, these are the hot buttons that really seem to set you off, or that play the mental games with you. So, you're kind of allowing those to impact you mentally, and you're, giving the time and the energy, and you're allowing that to have these negative effects on you when you absolutely shouldn't do that, right? But we fall victim of that as men because of our persona, because of our ego, because of the things, our reputation, all of those things that are going around. We want to make sure that, we can protect, especially if they are, they're manufactured, right? They're narratives that aren't true about us. But those are still things that play in your mind. We also have as a tendency of men to kind of live this lone wolf, or back in the day it was called the Rambo, right? Where you're a lone wolf, you're on your own, you're trying to do things without the help or out the aid of other people. And a lot of times that lone wolf mentality leads to very destructive isolation. And, we find ourselves sometimes, in order to get away from what we believe is going on the outside, or what we believe people are talking about on the outside, if we're allowing those things to happen and allowing those things to get into our head, we find ourselves isolating. And that isolation, the negative isolation, is not a healthy habit. It is not a healthy response to what's going on around us. I have talked in previous episodes about what I consider healthy isolation and utilizing time instead of some of these, unhealthy habits, unhealthy behaviors, putting ourselves in situations that are from a negative nature, utilizing that time, utilizing that positive isolation to be productive. And we've talked about, and we're going to talk about more ways to do that as this series continues. But just know that, this isolation piece can be very devastating, especially since, some of these things that are going in our heads are, we're manufacturing on our own, right? We're coming up and with some of these things that may not even be true. Along with that, I know I did, and I know the men that I have coached, sometimes we tend to obsess over negative thoughts. And the example that I give is this what if scenario, right? And as you go through this divorce process, one of the things that I know kept me up at night and keeps the guys that I coach up at night is I don't know what's going to happen, right? The fear of the unknown can be crippling. And so what do? We kind of go to worst case scenario. As men, a lot of times, as we're trying to figure things out, as we're trying to plan for the future or to be prepared for what may happen, we tend to get ourselves in situations where we're thinking about and obsessing about worst case scenarios that, for the most part, will never, ever happen, right? And that's not healthy, because ultimately what that's doing is it's playing mind games with us. We're mentally circling the drain, and we're bringing in a bunch of negativity and scenarios in our head that are ultimately stealing the positivity and the joy and the productivity that we could be putting in other places while we obsess over those thoughts. So I think that's a key mistake. One of the other key mistakes that I've seen, and you may be doing this yourself, is the blame game. And I think from a mental perspective, you're in your head, you're blaming everybody for what's going on in your life, right? You're blaming your former spouse or soon to be former spouse. You may be blaming her family or your friends, even coworkers, and God forbid you're blaming the kids that, this is going on in your life. This is happening to you, right? It's this victim mentality. It's this woe is me. The world is against me. And that kind of plays a little bit back into the self-isolation piece, where you begin to shut everybody out, even those that love you and care about you and want to see you succeed and be happy. You shut all of them out, because what you're doing is you're almost projecting on them this negativity, this fear that's going on in your head onto them, right? So none of those things are good. And again, kind of going back to what I'd said, is it possible that some of these things are going to happen? Yes. Is it probable? Probably not, right? So you have to recognize those things, and you have to be ready, willing, and able to kind of hit the pause button when you start to feel that. Lastly, and we're going to do an entire episode on this, but the negativity that is in your mind, the mental games that you play, and how you begin to remove or retract all of these self-care type of things in your life, And ultimately, what that could lead to, if everything I just said, previous, it could lead to you deciding that life would be better for everybody involved if you weren't here. And as I've said in previous episodes, we're going to do an entire episode on suicide and men going through divorce, the suicide rates, the not only during the divorce process but after. When you take a look at the statistics, it's absolutely disgusting, right? On how many men choose to end their life because of what they found out either during the divorce process, trying to handle the divorce process, or what happened after that divorce was done and how they were left. It's absolutely incredible, and we're gonna spend some time on it because the data doesn't lie, the statistics don't lie, and it's something that we as men are battling each and every day, and it needs to be addressed. So we're gonna do that in a future episode. So that's kind of the mental part of this. The next piece about mistakes being made that I have seen or I have made deals with your emotional piece, and this is really where we as men historically don't do a very good job at dealing with our emotions, right? By default, we suppress our emotions. We avoid our emotions, or we avoid having conversations related to how we're feeling. We minimize the feelings that we're having, even when those that love us ask about it. So I think that, if we know that those are mistakes that we're making, and we can make the decision to do some things about it. And we've talked about therapy is one of them, where most men choose not to go seek professional help in dealing with their emotions during the divorce process or even after. And again, this is aside from if you and your former spouse or soon to be former spouse even went to marriage counseling. I encourage you not to utilize that experience for how seeing some professional to deal with the emotions that you're dealing with during the divorce and after. Those results don't correlate, right? Because you were dealing with the married couple and the issues going on there. Whereas if you choose, and when you choose to go spend time with your own counselor or therapist, and deal with the emotions that you're going through, you're going to be much better off. But that's a mistake definitely from an emotional side that men make. I think the other thing too, as men, we do allow certain emotions to come out, and unfortunately those are normally negative emotions. So things like anger or jealousy or rage or envy. We don't necessarily have a problem when we get angry, lighten somebody up, right? And that is not good, right? Because ultimately what we also find, and what I've found in dealing with, some of the men that I've coached, is that emotion, that negative emotion leads to the idea of revenge. And this is where it gets very, very dicey, right? Especially if you're going through the legal process, especially, if you have kids and everything else, the feelings that you're feeling of wanting to get back at your ex or soon to be ex or former wife, or the emotions that you're feeling if they have moved on already, they're not healthy. And I'm telling you right now, it's not even worth it, right? So one of the things that we're going to do and we're going to talk about is dealing with those feelings of anger and jealousy and rage and envy, and disappointment or frustration, or however you want to add to this. And really, what is the best way to channel that energy and move it toward a positive outcome? So those are a couple of the mistakes from the emotional side that men either make through divorce or I made through my divorce. And they're watch outs. They're things that you need to watch out for and be aware of. So as you start this process, or as you're going through this process right now, you can identify them, and we're gonna talk about how you can best overcome them and move those into the positive here a little bit later. Lastly, what I'll say is this: there are behaviors. If you take what's going on mentally, what's going on emotionally, but then you look at the behaviors that men make mistakes in doing, either during their divorce process or especially afterwards. It's really disappointing, right? Because they're reckless. There are so many reckless behaviors that men choose to do either during this process or afterwards, that doesn't help them. It doesn't help their children. And eventually, we're going to talk about it doesn't help define their legacy of who they are as a man and as a father, but what they bring to the world, and the gifts that God has given you and the man that God has intended you to be. It's so far away from that. And as a man, it's time to step up and be a man and make the right decisions and do the right thing. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. But you can't do that if you are throwing reckless behaviors out there, or doing and saying things that you shouldn't be doing. Some of those reckless behaviors, of course, deal with substances, right? So whether you had an alcohol or drug problem during your marriage, or it may have led to ultimately your divorce, or you didn't really have a problem with it during your marriage, and now that you're divorcing or have been divorced, you are noticing yourself moving to substances, alcohol, prescription drugs, illegal drugs, all of those things, those are behaviors, those are unhealthy habits and unhealthy behaviors that's not going to help you become the man you are and the legacy that you're going to leave. Also pornography, right? I mean, if you had an issue with pornography in your marriage that may or may not have led to your divorce, that's one thing. But if at the same time, too, you're continuing by utilizing pornography during your divorce or even after, again, that's not a behavior that makes you ultimately the best man that you can be for yourself, your children, and your legacy. So I encourage you, when it comes to certain things like that, certain behaviors like that, those are completely and totally reckless, right? But there's some other behaviors that may not be considered as reckless, but they're not healthy for you, right? And the first one is these dating apps. I've said to you before, and we're gonna have a couple part series on dating after divorce, because you don't want to date during your divorce, and quite frankly, you don't want to date right after your divorce either. And we're going to get into those situations and the why behind those in subsequent episodes. But what those dating apps are, especially if you're looking at them, during your divorce or right after, is you're just trying to fill a void. It's a numbing. And there's not a lot of healthy interaction on those dating apps anyway. And like I said, we're going to go into the data and the science behind those dating apps. We're gonna dig deep into the statistics and kind of how those dating apps run and all of that later. But ultimately, what you're trying to do is you're trying to fill a void. You're trying to find something that's going to numb that loneliness or aloneness that you have. And quite frankly, it can be a reckless behavior, because some of those dating apps or most of those dating apps, they have women on there that are not healthy for you. They are not healthy for you. And by getting yourself into situations with those women, you are not becoming the best man that you can be, and you are definitely not going to thrive after this divorce is done by wasting your time, wasting your money, wasting your effort, energy on those dating apps. So we're going to, again, talk more in depth about them in a subsequent episode. And lastly, the selfishness that I have seen of men during their divorce process, and especially after, related to themselves, their children, their family and friends. It's disappointing and it's disgusting. And, I think as men, we need to do a much better job at revisiting who we are and what we do after this divorce process is done. And so what do I mean by that? I have seen and been familiar with a lot of situations where men completely and totally check out from their children or their friends or their family. As I said before, their behaviors drive nothing but self-interest and selfishness. And that's a path of destruction, not only for the man himself, but for everybody around him that loves him and cares for him and wants him to succeed and thrive, even after having gone through one of the most difficult things that a man can go through. And I would argue a divorce, other than the loss of your child, is probably the most devastating thing that a man can go through in his life. And so the selfishness is rampant. And, I think that as a man, you need to look yourself in the mirror and you need to come to terms with, are you living the life that God has intended you to live? Are you the man that you intend to be and want to be? Are you serving as a shining example? And, what does this look like for your children and your family and your future with the behaviors that you're doing either during the process or right afterwards? And that's a hard conversation to have with yourself, because at the end of the day, like I talked about earlier, you can blame everybody else, but if you stand up and you look at yourself in the mirror as a man and accept responsibility and know that you're the only one that can control what you do and how you do it, it's a really, really tough conversation to have. Okay, so with that said, let's talk about what I mean by leaving a legacy. What is a legacy, and what does it mean to leave a legacy? And why is that extremely important as a man? So before we talk about your legacy, let's just make sure we're on the same page of what a legacy is. A legacy is really how something is remembered, right? Far after it's gone, whatever that is, it's how it's remembered. It's the impact that it had, this lasting impact to a person, to a community, to the world, and how it is defined, right? So when thinking about the term legacy and how and what you are going to leave as your legacy, start thinking about those terms, start thinking about questions that you can ask yourself, and really what it means when you define the legacy that you're going to leave by your behavior, by your actions during your divorce process. So I normally make correlations between real rock stars and you as a rock star, because you are a rock star. And if you haven't watched the episode where I define why I think you're a rock star and why I think I am a rock star, I encourage you to go to watch that video. But you are a rock star. And when you start thinking about how rock stars leave their legacy, it really kind of comes down into a couple key things, right? The first one is their persona, right? So, when we think of certain rock stars and we think about their persona, it may even transcend the music that they have, right? Or that they make. And, their personalities and the legacy that they leave with that. You also start thinking about legacies that some bands or some rock stars and performers have when it comes to, let's say, an emotional connection that is made, right? Or a feeling that you have when you're listening to a specific band or a specific performer. You may have some rock stars that were, or musicians that were barrier breakers, right? Or they are known for a cause or making an impact some way other than just their music, right? So they leave a legacy of, whether it's, I think we've talked about U2 and human rights, or we talk about Coldplay and their eco-friendly, environmental type of legacy that they're leaving beyond their music. But ultimately, the number one thing that rock stars and rock bands leave as a legacy is their music. It's their catalog of music. And that can be good or it could be not so good, right? Depending on the band and what they leave. But when you think about those bands over time, over decades of either they made maybe only a couple albums, and then unfortunately, if you look at Nirvana, they had a couple, and then Kurt Cobain passed and they never made music after that. Or if you have bands that have stood the test of time, throughout their career, maybe started in the 60s and have recently retired, like an Aerosmith, or, you look at those types of bands. Their catalog of music really speaks to what they've left the world, along with their persona, along with maybe some, political or, environmental type of causes that they're bringing, right? So when you compare yourself as a rock star to real rock stars out there, you have to start looking at, what do you bring in this legacy piece, and how does the navigation of your divorce process ultimately define you as a man, not only to yourself or to your children, but your friends and family and the community around you? Because ultimately, the choices that you make, good, bad, right, or wrong, will define you and will follow you ultimately forever, based on how you navigate this. So let's talk a little bit about how you handle divorce and your legacy, and what's most important, I think, ultimately, is your children. As I've said earlier on the episode, and not only in subsequent episodes, but in future episodes that we're going to have here, your children absolutely and totally must be your number one focus through the divorce process and after, period, right? There's no other beginning or end to that when it comes to making choices of not only how you are going to handle this divorce and how you are going to represent yourself and your family through this divorce, but ultimately what's probably most important is, what is the relationship that you're going to have with your children once this divorce process is done? Because again, this is a very finite season of your life. And as difficult as this season is, it is absolutely going to get better, and you will absolutely thrive in this after, if you make the right decisions, if you do the right thing, and if you build a legacy that you're proud of and become that man that God has intended you to be by making those right choices and doing the right thing. So, when you start to think about kind of, okay, well, how am I going to make my children the most important? Maybe you were a father that wasn't as involved in your kids' lives prior to divorce, right? Maybe it was more focused because of their age, or because you were the sole breadwinner and you were out working, or whatever it was. Or maybe you had issues that caused the divorce that took you away from your children, for a large part of your marriage, or now during the divorce process and after. Regardless of any of those scenarios, right, you now have an opportunity to completely redefine you as a man, right? You have the ability to get up in the morning, to look yourself in the mirror, and to make a conscious choice that you are going to be better than you were the day before. All right. And ultimately, you have decisions that you can make. Examples like, you have to take the high road. As difficult as the process is and as contentious as it can be between you and your former spouse or soon to be former spouse, it never does you any good in the eyes of your children to talk about or down about your former spouse. Regardless of what they're saying, regardless of what they're doing, be the man, take the high road, make the right decision, do the right thing, and I promise you, long term, it's going to benefit you, right? It's going to benefit you. Coming from someone who was the child of divorced parents, as well as a man who had children during my divorce. So don't do that. And if you focus on them and you're building your relationship with them, you have an opportunity to not only define yourself to yourself, but you have an ability now to show everyone else around you that you've made a conscious choice to become a better man through this. So let's talk about how you're going to do that, right? So once you put your kids first and once you make the decisions to do that, total side note, there's going to be opportunities for you to put your kids aside to be selfish, right? To go out, to try to live your life. You may experience these feelings where you need to go out and blow some steam, or I deserve this, or whatever it is. I'm just telling you, those are not healthy. Do not make the choice to become selfish and to follow unnecessary and destructive habits or negative behaviors, because ultimately it's going to blow back on you, and your children are going to see it. Your children are going to feel it. And I promise you, if you make that decision to put them first throughout the process and even after, it's going to pay off. It's going to be priceless. And I promise you, it's totally worth it. So that's just a complete and total side note. Okay, so how are you going to become the man that is going to leave a very lasting, positive, influential legacy, not only for your children, but for the ones that you love and the community that you serve? The first thing that I'm going to tell you to do is do this exercise. And it's really more of like a who am I, or who am I going to be? And I heard it described as write your own eulogy, right? So as you know, it's hard sometimes to think about actually sitting down and writing your eulogy. And I'm not suggesting that you have to write it out, although that would be an interesting exercise. I think ultimately what it comes down to is you deciding how you want to be remembered, right? As I said in the past, define yourself before somebody else does. So if you know the man that you want to be, even if you weren't that man before your marriage or during your marriage, there is no reason that you cannot become the man that you ultimately want to be, and that you know that God has intended you to be after this divorce process is done. So make the decision to do that and define it. Right? Define what does that man look like? What are his attributes? What does he do? And of course, I'm going to lead you down the road of the 7 key areas of life. And, those 7 key areas of life that we talk here on the Rock Your Divorce podcast about, and just focusing on a couple key components underneath each of those each and every day will absolutely help you get through the divorce process in a healthy way and thrive afterward. I promise you. But I think ultimately it comes down to one step at a time, one day at a time. And it's a saying that I say to people and I say to myself, and you have to win today. After you know who you want to become and you define it, right? We'll talk about vision boards in another episode. We'll talk about goal settings probably in the same episode, in the future, and how to do that efficiently and effectively. But ultimately, you have to define who do you want to be as a man after this divorce is done. And then walk yourself backwards, and what are those steps? What are those 7 key areas of my life? And what are the components that if I just focus on them a little bit each day, that I will eventually become the man that I have defined, not only for myself, but I know that God is intending me to be, most importantly, for my children, right? So that's the exercise that you can do when it comes to that. And then lastly, once you've done that, you've got to hold yourself responsible, right? There's got to be accountability. There's got to be responsibility. And we're going to talk about some ways across all 7 areas of your life that you can have accountability. You can keep the responsibility that you put out there. But ultimately defining your legacy and becoming the man that you ultimately can be and should be for yourself and for your kids and for your community around you is your responsibility, right? Nobody else is going to do it for you. Nobody's coming to save you. And you're the only one that can do it. So the reward of that is once you achieve that, and as you work to achieve and become that man, you can look yourself in the mirror and know that you made a difference because you got up every single day and made the choice to be different. So if anything that I've said today resonates with you or strikes a chord, I ask you to go over to www.rockyourdivorce.com, schedule a free 30-minute phone call with me, because I know that I can help you when it comes to not only navigating this divorce process in a healthy way, but absolutely thriving afterwards. While you're there, please like and subscribe to the Rock Your Divorce podcast. And if you know any men that are either currently going through divorce, no matter what stage that they're in, or they've been divorced and they don't really look like they're thriving, or they don't really feel like they want, or that they're where they need to be, please send them here to the Rock Room. Let them know about the Rock Your Divorce podcast so we can help them navigate the divorce process in a healthy way and thrive afterwards. That's it for another episode of the Rock Your Divorce podcast. I will see you here in the Rock Room for the next episode.